The boundary between real life and fantasy rarely blurs. And when it does, the fantasy often falls short under the harsh light of reality. Deep down, I understood this truth, but it didn't stop me from spending countless hours online, fantasizing about being transformed into someone entirely different, someone used and controlled for someone else's pleasure. In my real life, things were far from fantasy. While pursuing my master's degree in computer science, I met my wife, who was then working on her MBA. We followed the same path as many of our friends, working long hours, believing we were the new masters of the world. As time passed and we reached our 30s, we realized that life was comfortable, but it didn't feel like we were leaving any lasting impact. Financially, we were doing fine, but not breaking any records. We would be working for the rest of our lives. On the domestic front, things were no better. We settled into a routine that, over the years, led to less and less intimacy. However, there was one aspect of our relationship that stood out. Early on, I shared my cross-dressing interests with my wife. While she didn't fully understand it, she was tolerant because she knew it turned me on. This tolerance gave me the freedom to build a wardrobe and, occasionally, spend a day dressed as a woman. Although she wasn't a fan of my dressing, I kept it private, only indulging when she was out of town. But the internet, while giving me an outlet to explore my desires, also magnified them. It exposed me to new fantasies I hadn't imagined before. What I didn't know was that this would eventually change my life in unexpected ways. My life took a strange turn when my company underwent a major restructuring. Unlike many of my colleagues, I was offered a part-time job, though the pay was lower. The upside was that I could work from home. At first, the thought of working from home seemed ideal. I could dress during the day, without the usual constraints. But reality hit hard, and I realized that we'd be making less money, and my career was derailing. My wife and I spent a lot of time talking it over, and in the end, we decided we would be okay. I started working from home but refrained from dressing, feeling guilty about indulging in something so personal when my professional life was stagnating. But soon, I found myself overwhelmed by loneliness. The only interaction I had was with my dogs, and the days dragged on. It wasn't long before I gave in to my desires and began dressing during the day. Still, it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness. So, I started entering chat rooms on websites I'd visited before. At first, I stayed away from chat rooms, thinking I was above the people who frequented them. It was ironic that I eventually found myself in those very spaces, talking to strangers. It wasn't long before I became a regular, enjoying the compliments I received about my appearance. One person in particular caught my attention. He started off being very forward, but over time, I warmed up to him. He encouraged me to open up about my fantasies, pushing me to expand them. What intrigued me most was how he would take my fantasies and add his own twist, sparking new ideas in my mind. Before I ventured into the chat rooms, none of these ideas would have excited me. But over time, day after day, engaging in these discussions began to shift something in me. Looking back, the most significant change was my growing curiosity about being with a man. Initially, it was just part of my role in the chat, to keep conversations going, but it slowly began to occupy my thoughts. I started to get intrigued by the idea of being used, forced into acts that had never crossed my mind before. At some point, I didn't even realize when I crossed the line from merely playing a role to truly desiring these things. But once I crossed it, I knew it for what it was. The day would end, and I'd return to my normal routine. My wife would come home, and life would continue. Then, one day, my online friend showed me a white leather corset he had bought and asked for my address to send it to me. While I was indulging in these fantasies, I wasn't naive enough to share my real address. I politely declined at first, but he kept pressing, offering other things he'd bought for me. Eventually, I gave in and rented a P.O. box under my online persona, Victoria Eggert, and passed it along. Soon, I received a package containing a white leather corset, a leather choker, and gloves. The return address listed a name, James Kroger. I eagerly added these new items to my wardrobe, intrigued not only by the gifts but also that he had shared his real name with me. Naturally, I Googled him, but found nothing particularly interesting beyond that he lived in a nice suburban area near Chicago. As time passed, I looked forward to my chats, imagining myself transformed into James's ideal plaything, tied up for his amusement. We joked about me becoming his bride, wearing the corset under a slinky white dress. Every month or so, James sent me something new, a ring gag, latex hood, ballet boots. I welcomed these gifts, enjoying the fantasy that we created together, weaving elaborate stories about how he would transform me into his perfect wife. But then one week, I didn't hear from him. I assumed he was on vacation. Another week passed, then another, and I began to realize that I was having trouble quitting the fantasy. I tried to fill the void by talking to others online, but none of them compared to the intimacy I had shared with James. Then, one day, I received a letter in my mailbox. I was nervous, it required my signature, and I had only used my alter ego's name. If they asked for ID, I didn't know what I'd do. But when I arrived at the counter, the man seemed uninterested in questioning me. I signed and took the letter home. The letter read, "Dear Sir, aka Victoria Eggert, our law firm has been retained by the estate and trust of Stephen C. Kroger to dispose of certain assets. We are writing to inform you that $150,000 has been allocated for you, upon satisfaction of certain conditions, as a precondition to receiving the allocated funds. The trust requires that you undergo chest augmentation surgery and live privately as a woman full-time. The intention behind this is that it be viewed as a gift from Mr. Kroger, offering you an opportunity. The trust will cover the costs of the surgery, along with any related procedures, such as laser hair removal, liposuction, and others, up to a total of $15,000. While the intent is for you to live as a woman in private, you are not required to publicly identify as one. If you agree to these terms, a monitor will be appointed to ensure compliance with the requirements. The monitor's decision on compliance will be final and binding. This monitor will have the authority to conduct random checks at any time, day or night, throughout the year. If you accept the gift, the following payment schedule will apply. $6,250 upon acceptance. $6,250 monthly until the completion of the term. $75,000 upon completion of the term. If, during the year, you are found to be out of substantial compliance with the gift's terms, the remaining unpaid portion will be forfeited, and the gift will be terminated. However, you will not have to repay any sums already received. After successfully completing the term, additional funds may be offered as further gifts. We request your response by the end of the month to determine if you wish to proceed and to arrange the necessary monitoring of compliance. Regards. Name withheld." The letter took me by surprise and added an unexpected twist to my day. After initially being caught up in a whirlwind of fantasies, the reality of what was being asked made me stop and think. Over the next couple of days, I wrestled with the decision and realized I needed to talk to my wife. $150,000 was a significant amount, but could I really go through with it? And what would my wife think? Eventually, I sat down and spoke with her. I downplayed my online activities, making them seem trivial, and showed her the letter. I'm not sure if she fully believed the minimized version of my activities, but she took the letter seriously. The fact that we could keep this private made her lean toward accepting the money. We had an honest conversation about my concerns that she might resent me or feel differently if she had to see me as a woman all the time. She acknowledged the possibility, and we agreed that we would monitor the situation and back out if it became a problem. After our conversation, we decided to move forward, at least to meet with the attorneys and learn more. 3 days later, we found ourselves sitting in a very intimidating office in downtown Chicago, discussing chest implants and living full-time as a woman. The conversation was surreal. I felt detached, almost clinical, as we discussed how things would proceed. The firm had arranged for a monitor who would use both home visits and webcams to ensure my compliance. I would be required to dress as a woman at all times at home, except when we had guests. The goal was not to trip me up but to ensure I was in substantial compliance with Mr. Kroger's wishes. The more feminine I dressed, makeup, heels, jewelry, etc., the easier it would be for the monitor to certify my compliance. At the end of the meeting, my wife and I exchanged looks, and, with the same detachment I had felt during the conversation, we agreed to the terms. We signed the necessary paperwork, left the office, and walked out, a little shaken. The rest of the afternoon felt just as surreal. Since we were in downtown Chicago, my wife and I decided to shop for my new wardrobe. We actually had fun, almost as if we were both in a carefree state, picking out lingerie, makeup, and other accessories. We decided to hold off on dresses and skirts until I could review what I already had at home. Neither of us were prepared for me to try on women's clothes in public just yet. A week later, I was lying on a hospital bed, nervous and feeling a rush of stage fright as they inserted an IV into my arm. I couldn't believe I was actually going through with the surgery. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had been content living out my fantasies online, but now, I was about to make a significant change. I was scheduled to have chest implants, liposuction around my waist, and the first of several laser treatments to remove all my body hair. Although my wife and I had discussed only getting laser treatment on my chest, I chose to have my entire body treated without telling her. When I woke up, I felt like I had been hit in the chest. I had thought that going with simple C-cups instead of something extreme would be easy, but it still hurt. After the surgery, we left the hospital with me wearing a sports bra under my sweatshirt, starting my recovery and the beginning of my new life. It didn't take long for me to adjust to playing the role of a woman around the house. In a way, it gave me the freedom I had always wanted, but with the structure of being required to do so, avoiding a true confrontation with my inner desires. As I explored new clothing and looks, even my marriage seemed to improve. We had something new to talk about, and it brought us closer. We quickly settled into a routine, and I grew accustomed to my new clothes. My wife said I had settled on a preppy look with a touch of playfulness, and I loved adding high heels to anything in my growing wardrobe. At first, life continued as it always had, but with one major difference: I was now regularly wearing a bra and lingerie to bed. When we went out, I would still put on men's clothes, binding myself up, removing my makeup, especially my eyeliner, trying to look like my old self. Then, about 3 months into the year, I crossed another threshold. I needed to run out for groceries, but the idea of removing my makeup and changing back into male mode felt like too much effort. So, I simply went out and ran my errands dressed as Victoria. And that's how it started. Whenever I needed to do something that didn't involve people who knew me, I did it as Victoria. Each time, it got easier and easier to the point where I stopped second-guessing myself. In more reflective moments, I was amazed at how quickly I transitioned from a part-time crossdresser to someone living full-time as a woman. The monitor would occasionally stop by, but more often than not, she'd call and ask to see how I was dressed through a webcam. There was never any issue with my compliance, and the checks continued to come, adding a nice supplement to our income. As the newness wore off, however, so did the spark in our marriage. We quickly slipped into the same routine, which now involved almost no intimacy. In hindsight, we were becoming more like roommates. I probably made things worse by finding excuses not to go out with friends, as the back-and-forth conversion process was exhausting. The few times we did go out were usually just the two of us, with me going as Victoria. We both sensed the growing tension, but we didn't talk about it, hoping that things would return to normal once the year was over. As I entered the 12th and final month, the unspoken tension reached a peak when the law firm informed me that additional funds, enough for 2 more months, had been allocated. Additional funds were made available if I continued living as a woman and agreed to get hair extensions. By then, I had become accustomed to wearing a wig and had kept my hair short to make the transition easier, both for wearing the wig and for switching back to my male appearance. However, what stood out more than the request was the realization that there didn't seem to be an end in sight. It was something my wife didn't have to explicitly say, but I could see it on her face. At this point, we decided to accept 2 more months of funding, but deep down, we both knew that there would likely be more requests after those 2 months. We were starting down a slippery slope. Life was no longer returning to normal, and we no longer felt in control of where it was heading. It took me a few days to adjust to the hair extensions, but I ended up enjoying them. They were longer than the wig I had been using and felt lighter. The only downside was washing my hair. It was a hassle to get all the shampoo out, and each time I did it, I was reminded of the cliché about women being too busy to go out because they were washing their hair. As another month passed, my wife and I continued to drift further apart. We weren't hostile, but we stopped engaging with each other and just went on with our separate lives. We no longer kept each other updated. Then, as expected, the law firm informed us that if I agreed to get 2 tattoos, one of a unicorn on my left hip and one reading James's Slave on my right butt cheek, I could extend the arrangement for another 2 months. The thought of getting tattoos was more than I wanted to handle. Up until that point, everything felt reversible, like a game, but this was different. The idea of tattoos bothered me, even though I had already undergone chest implants and had hair extensions. It was a strange contradiction. I considered calling it quits, but my wife seemed unfazed by the request. I told her I thought it was time to return to normal, but her response was to simply take the money. Her lack of concern for what I was going through was telling. It showed how disconnected we had become. I decided to go ahead with the tattoos, almost as a form of self-punishment for getting myself into this situation. Then came the conversation I knew was coming, though it still hurt. My wife wanted to take a new job in Los Angeles, seeing it as a fresh start, and she thought it was time for us to go our separate ways. The conversation was long, and although we still cared for each other, I knew our relationship had ended. It was a fear we had discussed when I first received the letter, but we realized that the past 15 months had only amplified the issues we had never dealt with. As my wife prepared to move, we put our house on the market. Due to the showings, I spent a lot of time out of the house and found myself getting better at shopping. How many pairs of black patent heels does one person need? For still didn't seem enough. Luckily, we received an offer on the house just a day before my wife was set to leave for LA, taking the dogs with her. The closing would take place in 3 months, and I would handle the remaining details, including finding a new place to live on my reduced salary. Then another letter arrived from the attorneys. Before opening it, I considered just throwing it out, knowing that these letters had contributed to the unraveling of my marriage. But now, more than ever, I could use the money. And deep down, I realized that I genuinely enjoyed being Victoria. Even though it had only been 16 months, I found it hard to remember anything I liked about my old male life. I wanted to continue being Victoria. I opened the letter, and if my wife hadn't already left, she probably would have after reading the next request. The letter stated that, for the payments to continue for another 2 months, I would need to legally change my name to Victoria Kroger, which included updating my driver's license and passport. Of course, once the agreement ended, I could change my name back to whatever I wanted, but there would always be a record of the change on file, a fact that might haunt me later. I didn't think about it too much and simply agreed. 48 hours later, I found myself in a courtroom in downtown Chicago, dressed in a perfectly tailored women's suit with all the necessary accessories. My male name was called, and I was told to approach the bench. I watched the entire process as if I were outside myself, seeing myself, dressed as a woman, walk into the courthouse and confirm to the judge that I wanted to legally change my name to Victoria Kroger. The judge made brief eye contact, banged the gavel, and moved on to the next case. Afterward, I went to get my new identification, and the process was quick and without hassle. However, it didn't fully hit me until I was at the DMV. When they asked me to turn in my old license to get a new one, I felt, at least symbolically, that my old life had ended. I continued working part-time and spent my free time packing up the last of our belongings. It felt strange walking around as Victoria without the guilt of confronting my wife every day. I was beginning to enjoy this side of myself more and more, but the reality of my situation was still looming. Where would I live? How could I afford a new house? Would I have enough money to get by? Then, another letter came from the attorneys. Before even opening it, I was relieved to know I would have some more money over the next 2 months. This time, the request was for me to get my tongue and navel pierced, with an additional $2,000 offered if I also pierced my genitals. 6 months earlier, I would have rejected this request and ended the contract, but given my financial situation and how far I had come, I decided to look into where I could get the piercings done. Looking back, I should have been more cautious. The piercings hurt terribly for days, and once the swelling on my tongue went down, I found myself constantly staring at it in the mirror. I had never understood why people got 10 piercings, but now, strangely, I was proud of mine. It made me feel more feminine, and it had me thinking about the next step in my journey, experimenting with my new piercings. I had never been with a man before, but the more I embraced Victoria, the more I wanted to please a man. But before indulging in those thoughts, I needed to find a place to live. Time was running out, and I still hadn't found somewhere affordable in a good neighborhood. Then, unexpectedly, another letter arrived from the law firm. I was convinced it would be the letter that ended the financial support for Victoria, but instead, it simply requested my presence at an address in Wilmette at 1 p.m. the following Saturday. I immediately recognized the address. It was James's house. I began to get excited, thinking that maybe, as his final gift, I was going to inherit the house. My worries lifted, and I was on an emotional high for the next few days. Saturday arrived, and in tribute to James, I wore the white corset he had bought me, along with the white leather choker, gloves, and a white silk dress with spaghetti straps. When I arrived at the house, I was impressed by the large English Tudor-style home. I couldn't believe it might be mine. There were no cars around, so I assumed the attorneys were running late. I decided to step out of the car and take a walk around the grounds. When I reached the front door, I rang the bell, not expecting anyone to answer, but to my surprise, I heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, and standing in front of me was James Kroger. I recognized him immediately from our late-night webcam chats. My mouth dropped open in shock, unable to process that this man, who I had thought was dead, was now standing in front of me. James broke the silence. "I'm sure you thought I passed away, but while I wanted to give you that impression, my attorneys never said anything like that. It was my trust's wish that you continue your journey of feminization. Welcome home, Mrs. Kroger." He led me inside, and I blushed as he looked me over. I smiled back, realizing that he had taken me at my word and made me his perfect bride. We then embraced in a long kiss, and I fell to my knees, ready to give my new husband everything. If you appreciated this story and wish to show your support, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel.